Well, good day, everybody. This is Joe Van Cleve, and welcome to episode 86 of the Typewriter video series. We haven't done one of these episodes in a brief time, and so we're back to it, and I'm going to talk today about this Underwood Portable typewriter and a problem I thought I had addressed some weeks or months back. And when I went to use this typewriter this week to write with it, the problem reoccurred, which involves the auto-reversing mechanism of the ribbon spools. And in a general sense, I also want to talk a little bit about the greater care and feeding of your typewriter collection. So stay tuned. Well, first of all, let's talk about the ribbon feed or ribbon advance system on these older typewriters. I've owned roughly, I think, 3 typewriters that would come into this general age category. I had a 1936 Underwood Universal, I had a 1920s Corona 4, and this 1930 Underwood Portable. And I would say probably the Underwood Universal was the most reliable in terms of ribbon feed, but those older machines like this and the Corona 4s I found to be a little bit fiddly on the ribbon feed, and especially the Corona 4s, because the clearance between the inside of the ribbon spool cover and the modern size spools you get is really tight. It's not nearly as bad on the Underwoods here, but it's still an issue. The first thing I do when I have an issue with ribbons, ribbon advancement, ribbon feed, is I'm going to take these ribbon covers off. And they are left and right hand covers. And the nice thing about it, it's the UT, and that's not University of Texas, that's Underwood Typewriter Company. With the covers removed, obviously you're going to be able to see the problem happen and watch it while you're typing. But there's a greater question here, which is, should you make it a practice of taking the covers off when you're using the machine? Now that's an interesting question, because I've seen older photographs from the period of people, writers or whatever, using these portable typewriters, and I've noticed on a lot of the photographs they do have the ribbon spool covers removed. And it may be for several reasons. It may not be because of reliability issues. It just may be that they want access to the ribbon. If they're doing a lot of writing, maybe it's easier for them to replace the ribbon just by leaving the covers off. It also could be they lost the covers, but it's also possible they have these nagging little reversing issues and they want to be able to see it. Now, in the case of this ribbon cover, you can kind of see the ribbon moving in there through the slots of the decoration here, but you have to kind of be looking down on it while you're typing. So it is a lot easier to obviously type with the cover off. And obviously for diagnosing our problem, we're going to leave the cover off. So the problem that this typewriter had was, as I was typing, it wanted to constantly reverse and feed onto the left-hand spool. Now on the right side of the machine here, this little lever protruding is the manual control for changing the direction of the typewriter ribbons as it moves. And so back in the era of this typewriter, you had some ribbons had the grommets on the ends for auto reversing, but other ribbons didn't. And so if you were using a non-grommeted ribbon, you could manually reverse it with this button. And the way it works is it has 2 positions. Pulled toward the back of the machine as it is now, it takes up onto the right spool. And flipped toward the front of the machine, it takes up onto the left spool. There is a middle position where you can move the ribbon freely, like that. And then there's also the feature that the knob turns and feeds the ribbon manually onto whichever position. Like in this case, I'm set toward the rear, so it's taking up onto the right spool. And as I turn it, you can hear the ratcheting sound, and it'll take up. If you flip it forward so it takes up onto the left spool, you turn the knob the same direction, and now it takes up onto the left spool. When I first started typing with this earlier this week, I noticed that if you had it set to reverse onto the right spool, after only a few letters of typing, it would immediately reverse back. And when it reverses, by the way, this actual lever kicks into the other direction manually. So let's show you how this works. I have it set to advance onto the left spool, as it's doing now. And now I'm going to pretend like the grommet comes on the right side. It pulls the little lever out, and this flips over, and now this starts to move to take up on the right spool. That's what's supposed to happen. And the problem was it was constantly wanting to take up onto the left side. And if you tried to manually move this out and hold it on the right side, it would end up jamming the whole ribbon mechanism together, and actually the keys wouldn't even be able to operate at that point. Okay, let me show you underneath the machine how the basic ribbon system works. Okay, we'll flip this up here, and let me get my pointer. So the heart of the ribbon system is this shaft. It runs right here, and on both ends of the shaft is a worm gear. This is the worm gear, and then there is these two gears here and these two here. These two here have vertical shafts that run up and connect directly to the ribbon spools. So if you turn these little round gears, it'll turn the ribbon spools. Now this big shaft here has a pivot point right here, and this is the little knob that you saw on the right side of the machine, and it basically rocks this whole shaft back and forth. And so if it's, for instance, pulled forward toward the front of the machine, you can see it's going to be driving the left-hand spool because the worm gear is engaged in the round cog for the left-hand ribbon spool. And if it flips back this way, it disconnects this so the left spool freewheels, and now it's driving the right spool. Okay, so the heart of the machine is all about how it makes this thing flip back and forth. Now, what's a little harder to see is behind these two gears on the end of the shaft is a kind of a U-shaped bracket with metal fingers. And as I type, that ratcheting sound that you're hearing is the little fingers engaging on the little teeth. Those little fingers are crucial to how this thing operates, and they're operated by linkages that go up to those two little levers that sense the grommet on the end of the ribbon. Now, the way the feed mechanism works in this typewriter is you have the universal bar, and it's operated by whichever key you press. And there is a little drive linkage right here, and every time you type a letter, there's a little ratcheting mechanism that turns the shaft for the ribbon drive. And so you can see right now I'm driving onto the right-hand spool as I operate the universal bar. Okay, next, to gain access to show you more in detail how this works, and also if you were working on a problem like this, you want to do this to gain access, you want to first remove your ribbon completely, both spools, out of the machine, and then this front cover right here you want to remove. There's two screws, one here you're going to take off. This plate, the two screws are out. You're going to pull it a little forward, rotate the right side up and around 180, and then you can remove the margin release button from its hole here. Okay, so this is a view of the right ribbon spool mechanism underneath it. Now this vertical shaft you're seeing here is that shaft that comes up from the bottom that is driven by the worm gear on the right side of that drive shaft. There's a collar right here, and there's a screw right on that collar. If you loosen that screw, this whole drive vertical shaft here will fall right out of the bottom of the machine, so you can remove it pretty easily. But I want to show you is this a little bracket right here, and it's obscured by some of the type bars, but right up here, this is the little fork-shaped bracket that the ribbon runs through. There's a slot in it, and it feeds through the slot of this bracket. And as you're typing and as you're taking up ribbon off of the right spool like this, when it comes to near the end of the ribbon and the grommet comes over, the grommet's too wide to fit through the slot, so it forces this bracket forward like that. And there is a pivot point, this little rod here, little fork-shaped bracket, and there's a spring you might be able to see. That's the spring that causes this thing to operate. And the whole point of it is once the grommet pulls this arm out, it pulls up on that rod. And so when you're typing, and if you come to the end of it and the grommet hits like that, you can see now it switches, and now it's feeding onto the right spool. Now, another thing that's really important in the way this mechanism works, when I operate that little rocker arm up on top that is operated by the grommet, it operates this pivoting little arm. It's kind of a C-shaped arm, and it runs around the back of the gear here. And there is a shoulder screw right here that it pivots on. But what's key about this is these little teeth. That's instrumental in how this thing works. And like right here, this is the drive position for the left spool, and you can see that little tooth is catching the teeth of this gear here. The secret to getting this thing aligned precisely has to do with reshaping or bending this rod, the angle of this arm, and up on top is the bracket that pulls this rod. It all has to do with the clearance between the tooth and of this little pawl and the teeth of the gear, how much clearance there is on both sides. And you'll know that you have it set correctly when you can turn the ribbon manually in both positions like that. And what I was having a problem with was you could not run it directly like this manually. You could operate it one way, it was kind of really difficult. That ratcheting was real hard, and then the other way it was totally jammed up. And the adjustments for all this, there's quite a few of them, okay? So one of the things is the spacing, the horizontal spacing of the worm gear. If you loosen the set screw on the worm gear, there's a little gap in here. There's a flat spot on this rod, and you can move the worm gear a little bit left and right on both ends. So that's one setting. The second setting is up on top underneath the ribbon cover, that set screw that loosens this rod that allows it to fall out. You can actually set that. There's a flat spot, and you can set the vertical position of this cog right here. And then thirdly, this little set screw on the handle, on the knob, you can kind of move in and out as well. And you want to make sure that this screw right here clears this bracket right here. This is spring loaded. And there's two little curved slots underneath it that is where this rod sits. It sits either in this position or it sits in that one. So this is kind of a spring-loaded little piece that's pushing down onto the rod, and there's one on the opposite side, of course. So all of this has to do with getting the thing set properly. It took me literally hours to get this thing set right, to get the shape of the drive rod, which the vertical one down there that you see I'm pulling up, and also the shape of this arm on this little bracket. It took me a long time to get that set right. What I discovered the secret to it was there's two positions that you need to look at. So first of all, we're driving onto the right-hand reel, and in that position, this reversing rod arm should be able to flip freely its entire travel, just like it is now, okay? But when you have it set so the other spool is taking up ribbon and it's feeding from here like I have now, there should be a little bit of play like that, okay? It should have a little bit of play. That is very, very crucial, because the problem I had with this one was the right-hand side, it didn't have any play at all when it was feeding. It was just like that, and that's why it couldn't trip the reversing, because this little motion right here of this rod pulling up on it right here is because there's a little bit of play in it like that. And here's the left side just to show you. So I have it set to driving onto the left spool. So the left spool is taking up, and now you can see it has its full range of free motion when it's driving. And then if you flip it over to drive on the right side, so this is now feeding ribbon off of it, you can see it has that little bit of play, and that is important. That's the play that happens when the grommet pulls it out, and that is very important. That's what trips it. And as the shaft is being turned while you're typing like this, when that little pawl gets pulled out by the grommet at the end of the ribbon, instead of this gear being able to turn, the finger of the pawl catches that gear, and then the shaft is forced to move over like that. And that is how the reversing action happens. So to service this, I wanted to make sure it was clean and everything, and all the little parts were properly shaped. I loosened this set screw, pulled off the knob. I loosened that set screw underneath the ribbon, and I was able to drop this cog right out of the machine, that whole drive shaft. And then if you loosen this set screw, you can move the worm gear back a little bit toward the middle. That gives you access to the little curved pawl back there, that little rotating arm. What you want to do is take off this shoulder screw right here. And when you take off the shoulder screw, this whole C-shaped bracket behind this gear comes off, and you'll be able to get it off the end of the wire, that little loop in the end of the drive wire. You can remove it from that once it's free. And then you want to make sure that the surface of this thing that rests against this plate is all nice and straight and not bent and everything, not twisted and torqued. Make sure it's cleaned and degreased. Underneath this shoulder bolt, you might have a buildup of grease or whatnot that keeps it from rotating freely. But again, the shape of this thing is real crucial for that little gap right in there between the teeth. What do I do with this machine? Do I type with it with the ribbon covers installed, or do I take them off? Well, right now I have enough confidence in this machine that I do leave the ribbon covers on, and I really think it operates fine. However, when I had my older Corona 4, I would at least, I think it was the right-hand spool, I would have to take it off. It just wouldn't be reliable. And because of that design, the clearances between the ribbon spool and the inside of the cover was so tight. But this one, if properly adjusted, seems to work fine, and I have pretty good confidence in its ability to feed the ribbon both ways. What you're trying to avoid, okay, you're trying to avoid a thing where it only uses one part of the ribbon and it wears that part out. You want it to be able to feed through the entire ribbon back and forth to even out the wear of the ribbon, so you get a good life of ribbon. Some of you might be aware of the former late-night American TV entertainer Jay Leno, who has a large collection of exotic and antique cars, a large warehouse and workshop and garage for those, and actually a staff of mechanics and people who helps him maintain it. He's been critical of these programs on channels like the Velocity channel, where people do these car restoration projects in a half hour and the car is done and gone. And what he says in criticism to those programs is his fleet of old cars, he's constantly working on them. They're really never at a point where they're perfect. There's always little things that show up that it takes you a long time to fix. And this kind of relates back to the whole idea of having a fleet of old typewriters. I don't really think realistically that an old machine like this can be used regularly without some degree of maintenance. An example is this little ribbon drive problem. A lot of these problems happen, they're intermittent. Like you'll find if you start testing the machine, all of a sudden the problem seems like it's gone away, and you say, oh, I fixed it. And then you let the machine sit in the closet for a week or two, you take it back out and you use it again, and the problem has come back. And a lot of this has to do with the greases and oils and lubricants that are hardened and old and may have dirt and grit embedded in them. When you start operating the machine, the little bit of friction that happens because of constant use heats up the grease a few degrees, and that causes it to soften and actually work okay. But then you set the typewriter back down in storage and those greases and lubricants congeal a little bit. Well, now the problem starts to happen again. If you have a cold garage, I'm not talking freezing cold, but something like in 40 to 50 degree Fahrenheit range in the winter, like my little insulated garage, it stays about 45 to 50. Keep your typewriter fleet out in that garage over the winter. You'll know if you have intermittent problems, because you bring them back inside, you let them warm up to room temperature, but then you start using them and you'll start to see these nagging problems. So all of this is to say that to be a long-term owner of a fleet of typewriters means you're going to have to acquire the skills and tools and knowledge to learn to handle little problems like this on your own, because they're always going to crop up. These machines are incredibly complicated mechanical devices, and everything that moves mechanically on this machine has a pivot point where there's one piece of metal either rotating against another or sliding against another or pivoting or something, and all of those little pivot and sliding and rotating surfaces, those interfaces, are susceptible to friction, wear, debris, residue, It's just part of the reality of the physical mechanical world. And so that is part of maintaining a typewriter, is learning to deal with these problems. And it helps to be logical about it. What part activates this? What causes that? In the case of this ribbon drive problem, the key thing to understand is the mechanisms on both the left and right side for reversing the ribbon, these little guides here that pivot out with the grommet. Everything has to be balanced. All the spring forces on both of these arms have to be very similar, very equal. The pivoting little C-shaped arms underneath with those little pawls on them, those all have to be the same kind of tension. Everything has to be equal, so both sides are equally balanced, and that way the ribbon reversing can happen both ways. So you're looking for, in the case of a problem like this, you're looking for things that are out of tolerance, like one side, some little piece is way different than the other side. Well, that might be an indication something's off, right? So that's kind of my little thoughts and commentary on the care and feeding of a fleet of old typewriters. Is you'll never be completely done with maintaining typewriters. It's part of maintaining them, part of ownership. It's like owning an antique automobile. If you lived in between the world wars and you had an old Ford or whatever car you had, it was a normal part of car ownership to have to clean the spark plugs regularly, clean the points in the condenser in the ignition system regularly, clean the fuel filter regularly, obviously oil changes. These days, modern automobiles are so well engineered that you could almost drive them into the ground without any kind of maintenance at all other than an oil change. But older mechanical machines like this are like those old cars. There's constant things to do, and that's part of the joy of ownership of typewriters. Well, I hope this gave you guys a little bit of inspiration and confidence that you too can maintain your typewriters. And until next time, you have yourselves a great day.